do want to get your expertise here because I do think that this is something we try to go into the deeper elements of the game in general, and this is a great one because I would say I'm more knowledgeable than the average fan about contracts and the salary cap in general, and then I read writing from somebody like you, and then I go back to thinking, no, I don't really know anything about any of this. And that's why we have to have you on, because I think people oversimplify this because they don't understand the information. And so that's why I want to have you on. Josh covers the NFL as a whole, and I believe now works for PFF, right? Josh, you've signed up with them, and congratulations on that.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, I've been contracted by them to work on their free agent project this year. So the top 250 free agents, as they've defined it, I've been putting together contract projections for them. And it has been, since entering the NFL space, this would probably rank up their top 3 opportunity and just experience. So it's been a blast and certainly surreal.
It's very cool, and we use PFF data a lot on this show, and I get a lot of my information from there. It's a great outfit, and people should be following it, so we'll make sure to direct people to that at the end of the interview. But that's why I wanted to have you on, because we've got to understand, you had a former, I think you're kind of pausing that for now, but you had the NFL According to Q Substack where you took people through kind of the projected offseason, and you did one of those with the Lions before you put a pause on that. And I wanted to kind of pick that up because this is going to be an interesting offseason for the Lions as a whole, and much more complicated than they've had, I think, the last couple years. There's going to be some restructuring. I could see some trades in there. Obviously, they've got the draft portion and then free agency before that. So I kind of want to get your summary of the offseason from your perspective with the contracts specifically related to the Lions. So kind of working through part by part in the order of the offseason, and then also kind of educating us on things that maybe are underrated as far as informationally in each of those phases.
Sure. Sounds great.
So we've obviously, right now everybody's kind of looking forward to the draft, but that's not the first thing. That's where the fans go. We've got a lot of work to do before we get to the draft. You have the restructuring of contracts that can potentially free money up, and I think that's a good place to start as far as kind of the salary cap versus actually cash available and how people kind of manipulate that. I think taking people through the process and kind of how you go about planning for your salary cap and the differences in those things. I know this is a big question to ask you because you could probably do the rest of the interview on just that question, but it is an interesting topic, and people just boil it down to, well, how much cap do we have left? It's not quite that simple.
No, it really isn't. And the NFL salary cap is really just an accounting measure. But what every front office has to adhere to more ardently than the salary cap is really the cash constraints or lack of constraints that their ownership puts on them. And that becomes the real budget for how teams operate. And so what it really is every year they go into ownership's office and ownership says, this is how much I'm willing to write checks for in terms of real money. And from there, they have to build out their roster. Now, as they go and build out their roster, let's say an owner says, you have $350 million to spend, which is a really high number. From there, the salary cap's only $305 million. So that means when we're structuring contracts, we absolutely are going to have to use some of those salary cap machinations to lower what, if we're giving $15 million to this player in cash, we're going to account for it in a different way where only $5 million of it goes to the salary cap this year. We'll account for the other 10 in future years. And so that just becomes an accounting measure. But the cash is the really, really important part because at a certain point, every owner is going to say, I'm not writing any more checks. And for the Lions, it's the most fascinating thing from my vantage point watching what they're going to do this year because they have a lot of cash outlays ahead of them with many of these extensions that they've done over the last few seasons. And if they stick to their recent spending habits, they don't have much cash to actually spend. And that's what's so fascinating.
It is, and they really do have a lot of options because they, like you said, they have kind of been over. I think I read this from your page that they've kind of had a certain average that's been slightly over the cap and over the average spending based on when Holmes has been there. And now, but they kind of have the whole wide range because they are likely to do something like that because they could be a little bit more aggressive in free agency, and we'll talk about that. But they also could clear up a lot of space by restructuring contracts. So they're also one of the highest ranked as far as what they could actually have to spend. But that doesn't mean that they're going to clear that and going to spend it, because that's a big thing that kept happening over the course of the last year or two when fans, they always want the big trade acquisition. They want the big free agent, and they say, hey, we've got money to spend and we've got salary cap. Why don't we just sign a guy? You made a good point earlier, Josh, that it's not that quite that simple. They might not have the money to spend because they might not be approved to spend it.
Correct. Yeah. And that's what's so interesting about the Lions' recent track record has been spending about 3% above the salary cap every year. We have a fairly tight range of what the salary cap is going to be this year. It's going to be somewhere between $301 and $306 million. I think it's going to come in right at 305. That's where I've been for a few months. So if we use that just as our benchmark, that means that based on their historical trending or spending over the last 5-6 years, their cash budget is probably somewhere around $314, $315 million. Their current cash outlays for 2026, just based on their current roster, is somewhere around $284 million. So you say, okay, well, then that means they have about $30 million to spend. You got to also consider their draft class. They have to give real cash to the draft class. That's about $24 million. So that leaves them, if they continue with their historical trend, with only about $6 million unless they start cutting players and not restructuring, because, again, restructuring, the players still get the same cash. It's just accounted for in a different way. So I think that there could be potentially a cut or two that may surprise some Lions fans. And I really think it's actually a combination of these things. I think that ownership is going to approve a higher spending threshold this year and allow them to really push their chips all in and say, we've got a window here. We've been close the last couple of years. This past year was really a bad taste in our mouth. We want to get back to where we were 2 years ago and even further. And I think they may approve spending up to maybe 10, even 15% over the cap for maybe a 1 year stretch here.
Interesting. You've set me up with a perfect tease there. We're going to take a quick break and then come back and I want to talk about those possible cuts that you've identified, and then what they'll then do with the combination of money if they do get approved by Hamp and crew to go over that. So we'll come back with Josh Queipo of PFF. Stick with us. You're listening to Shayne Graham's Extra Points on Jethro FM. Happy to come back here with Josh Queipo. Sorry about that, Josh. But
no worries.
But Josh Queipo, I'm glad you corrected me on that. And talking Lions salary cap and salary cap as a whole, because I do think that these are necessary parts of education for the average fan. You can pay attention to whatever you want, and obviously it's all a choice to pay attention to football in general, and you don't have to, but it's good to know these things and be educated on them. So I'm curious where we left off there. We were talking about maybe identifying a couple cuts that might surprise people. That I feel like the two names that have been brought up a lot, one of them now has kind of maybe changed, or maybe that's one of your surprises, but Taylor Decker has declared that he's going to come back. There's two people on that offensive line, Decker and Glasgow, that were kind of in the conversation a lot for a possible cut. I'm curious if those guys are who you're talking about, because I know that there were still some people saying, hey, even if Decker came back, this still might not be a slam dunk. I don't know if I see that, but I have seen some writers on the beat talking about that. So I'm curious who you kind of have identified and if those people are kind of in the conversation.
Yeah, Decker's the one that really kind of stands out. He's 33 years old. I think last year took a step back. It's fair to wonder what that'll look like here in 2026. None of his salary in 2026 is guaranteed, so if the Lions were to part ways with him, they can save a little over $18 million in cash, not to mention they do clear some salary cap, and as it stands right now, just looking at overthecap.com, they have to make some moves to clear some cap space to be compliant by the first day of the league year. So just cutting Decker would get them there in both regards. It would save them the cash, and it would make them cap compliant to start the year. So I think that it's definitely one that's on the table. What I think may be a more likely scenario is they go back to Decker and they say, look, can we renegotiate this? Can we lower your actual cash that's owed here in 2026, and we'll guarantee the money? And that's maybe something that his side is amenable to, especially if there's a really good relationship between him and the Lions and he wants to finish up his career in Detroit. So that, I think, could be a more likely scenario, but he's still definitely somebody I'm eyeing as a potential cut candidate.
I'm glad you brought him up because I think now people are kind of going, okay, that we've resolved this issue. Now he's back on the team. We know that he's going to hold down the left side of that line, but you could tell even by the way they addressed it in the press conference at the Combine that there's not a lot of reason to be confident that he's going to be there for all the games. I think the plan already is for him to not be there all the games, give him rest, give him designed rest to make sure he stays healthy. And you don't know what you're necessarily going to get from him in general. And it is quite a high number for somebody his age and for the level of production. And if it's something that you're going to have to address anyways, I would imagine that they probably will spend some draft capital on somebody that projects as a tackle and maybe even try to identify somebody in free agency to fortify that on the cheaper side, obviously. But you're doing that with funds, with cash, with allocation that you don't really have because of Decker's number.
Yep, absolutely. And obviously with everything that happened with the offensive line last year, it's a scary proposition because they already had so much inconsistency there. And now you're taking somebody who they have relied on for quite some time, and you're potentially looking to change that and creating even more change on the line. And this is really where that offense, was built through, was a fantastic offensive line over the last few years. And that became kind of an Achilles heel for them last year. And adding even more uncertainty is a scary thought. But it's something that they definitely have to at least consider as they try and figure out what does this offensive line look like in 2026.
Now, is Glasgow also in this conversation? To me, he's kind of the most obvious of the potential cuts, but you would know much better from your perspective. But just as far as what he's set to make, I would imagine. I know he's been a big part of this team, both initially when he signed with them and then when he re-signed with them. But he's kind of got some of the same issues that Decker does: mobility, injury history, age, and his number is kind of high for what his projection of his contributions would be.
Yeah, with Glasgow, it's less cash, so I think that he's a little bit safer in that regard. He's only due $7 million this year. Again, older player, 34 years old. Could he get that on the open market? Probably not quite that much. So he would be one that I think that they might consider. But I think, again, the differences in how much cash each one is owed this year makes Decker the one that I've been monitoring more. But Glasgow would be the second one on that list of just keep an eye on it.
Interesting. Is there anybody else in this category that you kind of have your eye on, or can we kind of move on to the next phase?
I think move on to the next phase, because all the other guys making a lot of money, it's mostly guaranteed money. So they can't move on from those players unless it were via trade.
Okay. So as far as I know we talked a little bit about restructuring and how it's different as far as the cash goes. Is there anybody that you kind of do think that they will do that with? Because that is a big part of the discussion. It's a different discussion, but do you see restructures or trades that are kind of identified in your eyes as far as guys that they would identify for maybe one of those two categories?
Yeah, I think restructures the three most obvious guys. And usually when teams go to restructure, if they're trying to maintain healthy cap, you want to restructure players who you expect to be with the team, for years into the future and who are still producing at a high level. So I'd say Jared Goff, they can clear up to $40 million in salary cap just by restructuring his deal. Amon-Ra St. Brown would obviously be another one, and then Penei Sewell. All three of those, I think, would be top of the list for them, and would clear plenty of cap. So from a cap perspective, you do 2 out of those 3 deals, you probably have enough cap to do whatever you want to do in free agency. As far as a trade goes, just for a fun exercise, I know, the thing in Detroit has been, how do you complement Aiden Hutchinson really well? And I think that there's real legs to a Max Crosby trade out of Las Vegas. Detroit would be a really interesting landing spot for Max, and you put him and Aiden on the same line and just let them go to town. And I think Vegas would want 2 day 1, day 2 picks out of that, and a good young player. And I almost think one that I have posited myself is if they do something like that and they include Jameson Williams and give Vegas a receiver for likely Fernando Mendoza to throw to.
Interesting. Okay, you're hitting on a lot of notes here, because I'm kind of a wet blanket on these kinds of things, because I am constantly reminding fans that it's hard to pull off these trades, and it's not always the best to pull off these trades. But I do like the Crosby thing in general, because I do think he's one of the best possible pairings. Clearly, him and Hutchinson have this weird kind of bromance that they're developing via social media. He's got the Michigan connections already. He is the most valuable piece to a franchise that's clearly in a rebuild. They're basically in a full rebuild. I do think that Mendoza, I'm an IU alum, Josh, so just to kind of give you a disclaimer, so I'm going to be higher on Mendoza than most, but he did help change the culture along with Cignetti in Indiana, and I could see him doing that in Vegas, depending on how the coaching change goes, and they've got Brady in the mix. But yeah, they're going to need to acquire some assets, and Crosby is their best bet to do that. I don't even know what the second best asset would be on that team, other than obviously the high picks. But as far as players go, Crosby's the clear asset. He doesn't align with their timeline, so I do think they'll be motivated to trade him. I think Detroit would be one of the more motivated teams to get him. He's an ideal partner with that he's still a heavy edge that can rush. He's one of the elite guys that can do both. Usually you're having to choose, and I could see that. He's obviously got the injury history. There's a downside to that, but JMO is an interesting inclusion there, because I think people are still a little bit torn on him. You've got Tesla kind of waiting in the wings as a big receiver that could potentially take the mantle there. So that's an interesting one. That's in one of the more realistic scenarios that I've heard, I think.
Yeah, and the reason why I think Williams, when considering a player in a trade like this, which I do think, again, Vegas would want some picks to help rebuild, and I think that they would want a player who gives them a little bit of talent certainty, because obviously draft picks are still dart throws. And Williams, I think, would align for them in many different ways. Number one, he's young. Number two, there's cost control there, because he does have the extension that just came in. And then number 3, the receiver to pair with the young quarterback. That's obviously kind of a really good meld there as well. Where I think it also helps the Lions is because of the extension, Williams, he's getting paid a decent amount of money. It's not that much this year. It's actually only about $14 million in cash. But again, we were talking about there may be some cash constraints on Detroit. Even if they up their spending for this year, there's an offset. Max is actually only due like $31 million this year. So if you send Jameson over to Vegas, you're offsetting 14 of that $30 million. So you're effectively getting Max for half the cash for 2026. And that, I think, can play into it as well and be something that would help Detroit as they're doing their full roster rebuild. Or not rebuild, but their full roster management.
And it is a marrying of, because this is what you always want to look for if you are a team that, quote unquote, has a window like the Lions and has the possibility of making a run to the Super Bowl. You do want to try to pair up with a team that isn't in that same trajectory. And the Raiders are one of the first ones in that category. They're going to take a little bit of time, no matter how well my buddy Fernando plays, but they're going to take a little bit of time. And so you want to kind of cull through those teams that have some assets that they will need to get rid of. That happened with the Jets, basically all throughout the year that Aaron Glenn took over. They got rid of their big assets, and now they're in full rebuild mode. So that's interesting. I'm glad you gave that tidbit. I'm back here with Josh Queipo, having a good conversation about the Lions offseason as a whole, and I just wanted to put a bow on the conversation here. I know free agency and the draft portion are very tough. It's not like the board is too open, and this is the case with the Lions. I think Lions fans are in the process of learning this if they haven't learned it already. They always want to dream book some of these trades, like the Crosby trade or some of the free agency acquisitions, and even the most experienced fan then will go. I remember when they were trying to acquire a cornerback, and they were talking about, okay, well, would a Reek Wolin fit in from the Seahawks, or would Asante Samuel be able to be picked up off the free agency pile? And then they signed guys that some of the fans hadn't even heard of. That's kind of the way the Lions do things. So I don't know that it's going to be easy, and it's probably too open of a question, but I'm curious if you have kind of some free agents that you think would be a good fit, or maybe even guys, because I've talked with some of the beat writers about Froholt, the center at Arizona, as a possible candidate, even though he is not a free agent, to maybe be moved or cut and then moved to the Lions because they might have interest with having Petzing in the fold. I'm curious if you kind of have your eye on anybody when free agency opens up for the Lions.
Yeah, I don't think Froholt would be somebody who's cut. I mean, he's just really good. He's outperforming his contract, so if Arizona were to move on from him, I think that that's somebody who they would look to trade, and I think they could find a partner. With that said, I don't see him moving necessarily at all. But just thinking about, like, interior offensive line, I do think that that's one to kind of keep an eye out for Detroit. And I think maybe a player who isn't on Lions fans' radars, but one who I came across when I was doing valuations, and I was a little bit surprised at how much I think he's going to end up getting, would be Chris Paul from the Commanders. And I mean, if they want to do some spending and just kind of secure an interior offensive line spot, I think Paul actually played pretty well last year. And he's going to get a bigger payday than most people think. So I've got him at kind of like a 2-year, $24 million deal. And I think if Detroit's serious about creating some stability on the interior, I think that could be a player that they might target.
Interesting. Yeah, I haven't really heard that one on the beat here in the mix of offensive line. I've heard some other names that maybe the coaching staff has been connected to. And I'm glad you made that point about Froholt, because that's how I interpreted it because I've read in several places that he would be a cut candidate, and I kind of looked at it as, Well, why? I don't understand between the age and the production. I don't understand why that would be as somebody that they would get rid of. It seemingly he'd still be on their timeline, and like you said, he's outperformed the contract. So I don't think he's the best place to save money. Not that we need to go into Arizona's budget, but kind of like with the Lions, he's not that good combination of aging and maybe a little overpriced.
Yeah, I mean, he's in my estimation, he's one of the better centers in the NFL. And yeah, I mean, he is 30, but again, he's just been playing really well. And Arizona got him on a really sweetheart deal a couple years ago. He's only owed $5.6 million this year. That is pennies in today's NFL for a decent center, let alone a really good center. So, again, if they were to part with him, I think they could get assets back, and I think that would be the route that Arizona would go. And with that said, I don't see them making that move and letting him out.
And I do think that would be somebody the Lions would be interested in, even if they did have to give up a draft asset for him. But I would trust your judgment on that. And that was like I said, that was the feeling I had from the beginning. I just thought it was kind of a too good to be true kind of thing, but he has come up a lot from the Lions beat as a whole. But they also don't have the same perspective as you do. That's why we like to bring folks like you on the show. So I'm curious what you think in the draft. Obviously, there's a lot of preceding items, all the stuff that we talked about. So butterfly effect is not in our favor in this particular case because you don't know what the preceding moves are, but there's some clear targets as far as position-wise of what we could see them taking in the draft. I'm curious if you kind of have pairings. I know you're more on the contract side, but pairings that you think would work for the Lions here in the upcoming draft.
To be completely honest with you, I wouldn't be the best person to ask. I would love to give you an answer, but anything I put out there right now would just be a shot in the dark. Mostly because I just haven't done enough research on what the Lions' needs are and paired that to my analysis of the draft itself. So I know this kind of sounds like a cop-out, but I'd rather be honest and say I don't have a great answer rather than just try and put something out there without much thought. So is it okay if I punt on this one?
We are on Shayne Graham's extra point, so we focused on the special teams here. So, yes, it is absolutely okay to punt. No, I honestly think that's the best possible answer because I think some people, and we don't do this on this show, I think some people just throw things out there because I'm going to be talking about this a lot in the draft cycle. There's a lot of things that get aggregated in the draft cycle. They see that some guy is highly rated. They see a beat writer write about him. They see a lot of the mock drafts. Now we have the mock draft trackers where the beat writers will then kind of aggregate whoever picks whoever's picked to go to the Lions in the first round. They'll then aggregate that and show that to the fan base. One, it's way too early. We're just starting the combine, and a lot of this stuff is going to change pretty dramatically. But I think it's a good answer in the sense that there's just too many things that are going to play out before then. And I think that's a good way to kind of educate people on the process too, because so much is going to be impacted by what they do in free agency, by how much they restructure, by a lot of the other pieces that they're going to have. They don't know who they're going to be able to re-sign, what the levels are. There's going to be guys that they're going to be interested in re-signing on this team, but that all depends on the levels, on what they're going to be able to re-sign them at. That's one question I guess I didn't ask you yet is possible re-signees from this team. I don't know if you've evaluated that quite yet, but that's another piece that people that's going to be a big part of this process here.
Yeah, as far as re-signees, I mean, they don't have a lot of high-profile free agents. I think the two big ones on the defense are DJ Reader, and if they want to bring Reader back, I think they could afford him because with his injury history recently, and he is getting up there in age, he's still pretty good when he plays. It's just a matter of how much are you going to get out of him, but I think he's going to come at a pretty reasonable price, around $4 to $5 million. The one that I have done some research on, just because I do cover the Bucks more specifically for another site, and the Bucks need linebackers. So I've dove deep pretty well into Alex Anzalone, and I don't think that he's one that Detroit is going to look to bring back, because he can still command a decent paycheck. I've got him at around 2 years, $15 million. And they've sunk resources into Derek Barnes already, and obviously Jack Campbell's going to be, in the near future, going to be one of the highest paid linebackers in the NFL, and they're going to need to save for that. And this is a really deep linebacker class. And so I know I didn't mention anything in the first round for the Lions, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were players in the mid-rounds for one of these linebackers. And I have done some research on the draft linebackers. It's a really good crop, and I think they could find some guys who play a lot like Anzalone.
I agree. And see, that's a good tidbit about the draft. That's kind of that is, you do have to pair up the need with the draft class that's coming in and what is a little bit more plentiful. I have seen a lot of good looking linebackers so far in this draft. So I could see that as well. Now, kind of the last thing that I didn't really hit is the potential extensions, because they have been a team that's developed talent from the inside and then extended them and tried to give them their payday. I think they're trying to show potential draftees and guys in the market, hey, we want to pay you for good performance. And you talked about the guys that have already gotten those extensions, but you mentioned Campbell. There's a few coming up, a couple dealing with injuries here. So I'm curious kind of how you see them handling the extension piece of this, especially with the injuries in the mix now and the potential cash issues.
Yeah, I'm not sure they're going to be super aggressive on extensions this year like they have in the past. But what I can give you, because I have looked at them, is I can give you my projections for some of those guys and what that could look like. So we'll start with Jahmyr Gibbs. The comp I have for his contract would be Christian McCaffrey's 2020 deal, and an extension for him I could see being 4 years, $22 million per year. So you're looking at 4 for 88 with like $60 million guaranteed, not fully, but $60 million in guarantees. And that would obviously set the market for running back. Unless Bijan were to sign in the same offseason, do an extension, I think Bijan probably clears him by a little bit. Then you have Campbell. Let me see if I can pull him up real quick. And that one's really interesting. And this is where it's funny, because this is going to be a big discussion with this draft season, because you have multiple linebackers who could go in the first round. But the way the NFL does their fifth-year options and their franchise tags is they lump inside linebackers with outside linebackers, which means that the outside linebackers, who are the pass rushers, really dictate the market. And the Lions are probably going to decline the fifth-year option on Campbell, because it will be way more expensive than any inside linebacker gets. But with that said, I could see him getting an extension for $22 million a year if the Lions decided that they wanted to go ahead and extend him early. So that's a really interesting one. And then Sam Laporta. Do I have Laporta? Thought I did. Actually, I don't have one for him. I'm not sure why I don't, but I'll have to. Oh, no, there he is. I do. So Trey McBride, 2025 would be the comp for him, and that would be 4 years, $20.5 million per year. So you're looking at 4 for 82. So, and then Brian Branch would be obviously the last one there. And where do I have Branch?
Well, that may have. I wonder if has that changed at all with the injury.
So I would say no, because a player isn't going to do an extension and give up value, because he has the benefit of time to rebuild the value. And I think the Lions have been one of the more progressive franchises in giving out extensions based on what they know a player can and will be in the future, rather than working on this moment in time, what is your value, even if there are some things pulling it down? And I go back to like the Aleem McNeil deal. I think that was a little bit, if you were to look at where he was at that moment in time, probably a little bit of an overpay. But what they saw where he was going, they knew that it was going to be fair market value for him. So I don't think Branch would give up the value. So if they wanted to do the extension, I think they would have to pay for what his high end possibility is and what he's shown in the past. And that would be like 4 years, $25 million a year. So you're looking at like 4 for 100 with Antoine Winfield Jr.'s contract as the comp.
Interesting. That's great stuff. I appreciate you taking us through. This has been a great summary of the offseason as a whole, because it is hard, as I mentioned, it is hard to go through piece by piece because all these pieces are going to change. That one domino falls and then it makes another move kind of irrelevant or not necessarily in play. But I appreciate all the detail that you've had here, and I know you haven't been as active on the Substack side, but let's make sure to send people where they can follow you and keep up on all this great information.
Yeah, if you're on social media, I'm on Twitter or X, and it's Josh Queipo, spelled QUEIPO_NFL. And then as far as my work right now, the contract projections are on for free agents are on PFF, and I write for Fansided. I've across their various sites, doing a lot of the stuff like the extension articles, very similar to what we just discussed with some of those potential extensions for the Lions. And then if there are any Bucs fans listening to you, I cover the Bucs over at pewterreport.com. So literally, if you turn left, right, or anywhere, you can probably find my work.
And it's great stuff. I'm glad you are getting the platforms that you have, because it's information that's needed out there, because there's so much that does get aggregated, like we're talking about with the draft coverage or just the national pundits that are taking the same information and just kind of passing it back and forth. This is information that people need and help kind of project into the future of what their franchise could actually look like. So I appreciate you coming on and talking with us, and hopefully we'll be able to have you back on as the offseason progresses here.
I look forward to it. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Josh. We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Bye.